With most of my videos covering a group of IDs, they share something in common. Some kind of theme to tie the video all nicely together. Whether that be talking about the Shi IDs alongside their conditionals and payoffs, or specifically Resonance IDs and Captain Ishmael slapped on the end in parentheses, pretending like I wasn't intentionally riding on the coattails of a very popular ID's recent release. But either way, it's finally time to stop all the fancy pretense and just give it to you straight. Let's talk about those strongest IDs. And before you say anything, yeah, I know, it is kind of weird I've never talked about this explicitly in a video before, especially considering my perhaps strange obsession with the lower dregs of Limbus society. And that was partially out of fear of public execution for expressing opinions, and also because most of the strongest IDs in the past weren't all that complicated or interesting, at least to me. Luckily now, I've grown thicker skin, and there are plenty of strong IDs that I've both not talked about before, and also have lots to them. So, in this video, I'll be discussing the strongest IDs in Limbus Company, and going over what exactly makes an ID strong, so that you can, on your own, better deduce on release if an ID seems worth going for to you. However, to keep this video not too long, I won't be covering more than one ID per sinner in depth. And even then, I can't give every ID I plan to talk about equal spotlight time, since, let's be real, some IDs are just a bit more wordy than others. And though we won't be going in any particular sinner order or anything, I will be starting by talking about Yisong, since when talking about the strongest IDs, it's probably best to start by showing the ID that every other ID wishes they were. Ring Yisong is pretty undeniably the strongest in the game. And while I have a whole video breaking down the two Ring IDs we currently have, that video was made only shortly after his release before I could fully digest how insane his kit is. First of all, Ring Yisong does something correct right off the bat. The first sign of an ID being strong is their coin amounts. Higher coins usually means you're just dealing more damage because more hits are being dealt. However, Ring Yisong doesn't even show his full coin amounts by just looking at these skills regularly, since his skill 2 is widely regarded as the best of its rank in the game on the whole, despite being a 1-coin skill. Contrary to this appearance, Sanguine Pointillism can be reused up to 2 times, and results in it rolling up to a 38 potentially when using it in an attack, meaning this is basically a 3-coin skill, and Ring Sang essentially has a coin spread of 3-3-4, which is very solid. While this reuse wants the enemy to have unique debuffs on them to increase the reuse chance, you don't even need it, since there's a base 40% chance to reuse the coin anyways, and he already inflicts debuffs himself, meaning Ring Yisong is very self-sustainable. Another potentially important factor in an ID being strong is not needing to always rely on a team. And while most IDs, including Ring Yisong, do get stronger when built around, he doesn't need it, which is only to his benefit. Okay, and I know I'm getting a lot of these out of the way quickly, but perhaps the single biggest factor to an ID being strong alongside high coin amounts is just their numbers. And obviously, Ring Yisong is no slouch in that regard. But these numbers could mean literally nothing to you if you don't know what the average is, and this varies based on ID rarity and coin amount, but on screen now are the common unconditional rolls of mid-season 2 and beyond 3-star IDs associated with their skill rank and coin amounts. I specify mid-season 2 and beyond since it marks a pretty significant jump in ID quality, and accounting for launch and season 1 IDs in these averages would kind of muck the whole thing up. I'll be coming back to the idea of averages quite a bit, but don't worry about memorizing any of it since it is a lot. Looking at this data, if we account for his skill 2 as a 3-coin skill, even without his bleed count conditional for more coin power, it's just completely unfair how strong it is. And though his skill 3 is just about at the average, at least as far as rolls are concerned, his skill 1 rolls an 11 compared to the usual 9 roll on 3-star IDs, completely for free. Since your skill 1 is your most common skill, this is very nice, especially so considering how much of a hindrance a 9 rolling skill 1 can feel like. High numbers are useful for both clashing against enemies and also just for more damage. And while Ring Sang has both of those things covered pretty well already in his base kit, he also gains offense level up on hit if the opponent is bleeding enough, which he can usually get going with just a bit of luck or a bit of help. 6 offense level up gained from hitting an enemy 3 times in a turn, which is guaranteed on all of your skills if you get the skill 2 reuse, means you just always have +2 clash power every turn. And accounting for all of his conditionals, plus this offense level clash power, it's no goddamn wonder Kim Ji-hoon tried to kill that which he created. That's not even mentioning that Ring Yi-seng is a fantastic ID to use Ego on, because he also regains SP when hitting opponents with enough bleed on them, in addition to the offense level. And I definitely could go on, for at least a while longer about Ring Yi-seng. But I did already make a whole other video featuring him, and there's hardly any actual discussion on if he is as good as people say he is, because he just is. And because of that, he works well as a comparison point for what other IDs want to reach in terms of raw damage, clashing, and even status utility, even if he is, well, impossible to reach the heights of. Now, as I mentioned, I can't talk about the other strong Yi-seng IDs, at least not in depth. But don't take my high praise of Ring Yi-seng and use it to assume that other Yi-seng 3-star IDs are worthless. Spicebush and Solemn Lament Yi-seng could be a topic of discussion for its own separate video even, about which one is better for syncing, but when talking about being the best, it's simply impossible to compete against Ring Yi-seng. Now, the exact opposite of Yi-seng's singular polarizing ID is Sinclair, who has 3 IDs that most people would agree are at least relatively close to each other in power level, those being N-Corp, Senk, and Dawn Office Sinclair. Again, I have already made a video discussing N-Corp and Senk Sinclair, and I personally believe those two are the stronger IDs compared to Dawn Office Sinclair, with N-Clair's insane raw damage potential at the cost of some consistency, and Senk Sinclair's absurdly good and consistent numbers at the cost of some raw damage when compared to N-Clair specifically, but are fantastic if you look anywhere else. However, those two are much more straightforward IDs, and do not require nearly as much overview as Dawnclair, who I will finally be talking about on this channel after, seriously, I kid you not, scrapping a video about his kit 3 times in a row. God damn it. My wasted time aside, Dawn Office Sinclair is a very unique ID in a game that is starting to become chock full of those. He basically has 2 entirely different set of skills when he has his ego versus when he doesn't have his ego. He starts off in his baby form, which is, it's pretty bad. For the first couple of turns of using Dawn Office Sinclair, he is basically a 2-star ID, and I can't understate how annoying that can feel to play with, especially his skill 1 with a base power of 3. However, once you reach 40 SP, or you pull a funny Ruina reference and kill 2 teammates in 1 turn like a psychopath, he will enter his proper form. While 40 SP is already an easy conditional, it is actually made even easier for Dawnclair to reach with his accelerated Sandy gain on Clash Win, and especially with his baby form skill 3, Stigmatize. Meaning getting into this form isn't too difficult at all, so long as you can win 2 or 3 clashes, or leech off of other SP gain sources, but more on that later. More importantly, once you are in the wax and pinion state, given you have 5 Wrath Ego resources, your coin power gets increased by a ton, up to 3 extra coin power at 45 sanity. In addition, you also get 1 final power against burning targets via Volatile Passion, a buff automatically given to you in this ego state. However, he will also begin to lose sanity when using certain skills, and an ever-increasing amount of sanity on turn end is lost, up to 40 SP lost per turn from that same Volatile Passion buff. And if you ever reach 0 SP or below, you're back to being a boy failure once again, being plagued with memories of those good times in high school where you hit your peak. So Dawnclair is like N-Clair's Sandy management, but taken to a much higher level, which does slightly hurt his viability right off the bat, since his amount of turns where he can function as an ID are kind of limited. However, that's only if you assume he doesn't have any support. By using SP supplements like Base Yi-seng and or Base Hong Lu's supported passives, or especially Faust's passive or support passive, you make it easier to maintain this ego state, and his payoff is pretty damn good, with his skill 1 turning from a pretty pathetic single coin 10 roller into a 24 rolling 2 coin skill if you hit the reuse and have 45 SP. His skill 2 is highly notable for gaining attack weight, which is another thing to keep in mind for ID strength, since hitting more enemies means potentially doubling or tripling your damage output straight up. And while this skill 2 in particular really wants you to be at 45 SP specifically before firing it off for the extra attack weight, it is a damn good skill if you do so. Rolling up to a 24 once again, while hitting up to 3 enemies, and inflicting burn and burn count via his passive and the skill itself. Lastly, his skill 3 is just a single target nuke, which can be boosted to insane proportions if you set up proper Wrath Resonance in preparation for using it and have burn on the enemies. This is also an important skill to note, because it does kind of break the rule I set before about needing or wanting lots of coins to be a truly strong ID, and that's why those are more general guidelines rather than strict things that every ID needs. The only real downside of Blazing Strike is the massive sandy loss at the end of using it, meaning you have to use it early on into your wax and pinion state, otherwise you're basically accepting going back to the baby form, or you're accepting not using it at all. Because of this skill 3 wanting burn, and also overall requiring a bit of sandy management, Dawnclair does lack the ease of use that makes someone like Ring Yi Sang so damn potent. However, that's not to imply he's bad at all. The fact he can compare to IDs like Sinclair or Enclair under correct circumstances is impressive in its own right, considering just how good they are. And while that is all I have to say about his kit, it would not be an overview of Dawnclair if I didn't mention that this is the only ID in the game to be buffed heavily after release. Zweirodien and Sunshower Heathcliff have received smaller direct changes, but Dawnclair basically has 2 entirely different states. In my opinion, this was done well, and also obviously done because he was a Walpurgis-knocked ID, and I'm sure Jihoon basically had cartoonish dollar signs popping out of his eyes when he thought of the idea of buffing Dawnclair to be more like what people wanted, and I respect that as someone who also likes money and being favored by the public. Subscribe, by the way. All that to say that despite everything that Dawnclair may have required and does require now, at his peak, he is still definitely among the best in the game. And if he seems like an ID you would like to use, once you get used to him, he will put in very good work for you. Now, how about we pick up the pace a little bit and cover a batch of IDs all at once. Diechirodian, Diechihonglu, and Meursault. These are easily the best IDs for their respective sinners, and they all share a similar through line, that being discard. While discard as a mechanic is pretty simple, I will be talking about it a lot, and some people may not understand how it works fully, so let me give a quick overview of how discard works just in everyday use. Let's assume you have just one skill slot and you use a skill that discards. It would simply remove that other skill if it is able to be discarded that you didn't use from your skill pool of 6 skills to start with. As a more in-depth explanation, if you started a battle and used Meursault's skill 2 and discarded a skill 1 in the other slot, you'd be left with 2 skill 1s, 1 skill 2, and 1 skill 3 left in that pool of skills. The reason why this is so good should be obvious, since plain and simple, most skill 1s are gonna be your worst skill. So removing them in order to cycle to your stronger skills faster means the ID's overall DPS is increased due to less downtime. Diechirodian is the easiest of these 3 to just blindly use, and she is rightfully called the Queen of Unga Bunga, since she gains shield based on the rank of the skill she discards, and even more shield based on her amount of insight when she discards it. Insight is a mechanic we will talk more about later, but it's just a number equal to the rank of the last skill you discarded, and the cool thing about Diechirodian is you don't even need to care about discarding certain skills to get high insight. You can just press buttons and discard as many skill 1s as possible and still get some amount of tankiness for free. This constant flow of shield already makes Diechirodian a versatile ID, since alongside having good enough numbers, fantastic coin amounts, and more of those stronger skills than other IDs, she can also just eat one-sided attacks. Now, I won't pretend like tankiness is a requirement for an ID to be good, but it can be surprisingly helpful in certain encounters, especially if the enemies you're facing are particularly fast and you just can't clash against them. Alongside all of that, though, she also synergizes with the status archetype I would argue is the strongest in the game at the moment, that being sinking. More than that, she has access to Rhyme Shank, which, while it's not the borderline required ego like it used to be, is still the best status ego in the game, barring maybe Sanguine Desire for bleed team setups. But don't get it twisted. Diechi Rodian does not need Rhyme Shank, nor does she need a sinking team at all. Sure, it helps her reach her conditionals, which helps her skill 3 especially, but she's one of the safest IDs to throw into any encounter and get high value out of because of her immediate high damage, less skill 1s than the average ID if played correctly, easily accessible shield, innately high health pool, and, of course, the excellent synergy with one of the best ego in the game. Molar Otis is somewhat similar to Rodian in the sense that she really helps out her archetype, Tremor, but more importantly, she just has really solid skills and numbers. While her skill 1 is a travesty, most times you don't have to use it. And her skill 2 rolling an 18 with 3 coins means she is an above average and consistent clasher with good damage. And her skill 3 rolls a 16 by default with 4 coins, and can be boosted up to a 24 roller if you discard enough skill 1s before using it. However, a common complaint of those who don't really know how discard works is that you can end up in an awkward situation if you have 3 skill 1s lined up on that same skill slot, and I feel like for whatever reason, this happens with Molar Otis the most, which is unfortunate because her skill 1 is probably the worst out of any discard ID, and doesn't discard on its own. Unlike most IDs, which have to trudge through 2 turns of using mediocre skills or ego, Molar Otis and all discard IDs who have a defense skill that discard can just spend a single turn blocking to end up getting rid of 2 skill 1s at once. And in case discard couldn't get any more consistent, this works in an opposite kind of situation too, where you have 2 good skills that both discard. You don't want to use either of them since that would get rid of the other, but this is where we use the discard trick, patent pending, which is to place a defensive skill and then just use the top skill. Discard only works if there is a viable skill to discard available, and in this instance, Molar Otis's guard skill cannot be discarded. And it also doesn't get rid of the skill 3 we have underneath it for the next turn, meaning if you have a skill 1 on that top slot the next turn, you're back to cycling skills as usual. And while Diechi Rodian or Molar Otis can get good use out of this trick, no other ID gains nearly as much from it as Diechi Honglu. Without considering any kind of trick or discard, Diechi Honglu is admittedly kind of a whatever ID. Especially since his discard skills target the highest rank skill in his skill slots, which is bad, because as I've mentioned, the higher rank skills are the better ones, right? However, that's actually exactly what he wants. All of Diechi Honglu's skills gain some kind of benefit based on his insight, and he always wants it to be at 3, meaning you want to discard a skill 3 as soon as possible. First of all, it's actually easier to cycle to that skill 3 because of how discard works in case you don't have it to start with. And secondly, as soon as you can discard a skill 3, he's pretty much unstoppable. Since once you have your grubby little mittens on that 3 insight, we can choose to never let it go again by placing a defensive skill on the bottom and then never touching it. This does mean that we are no longer discarding, which sounds like it would be bad, again, but the difference is that with 3 insight, none of Diechi Honglu's skills are bad. His skill 1 becomes a 3-coin skill that rolls a 20 in damage and clashes at an admittedly just pretty good 12. His skill 2 rolls a 22, and his skill 3 a 23. If you feel so inclined to squeeze some more damage out of him, then you can continue to discard skill 3s when they come around, and try to activate his Gloom Resonance passive to give him 3 damage up, but he's a very hands-off ID once 3 insight has been achieved, and he's another one that slots in well with the sinking team, considering his skill 1 goes count neutral, and his skill 3 goes slightly positive. Similar to tankiness, I wouldn't go so far to say that every ID that has discard is innately better than an ID without it. But these IDs make a damn good case for it since they just so happen to have discard and very good skills and numbers. It's an incredibly strong mini archetype that, when utilized properly, can make other IDs feel kind of underwhelming to play because they actually have to deal with the downside of having to use 3 skill 1s eventually. Meanwhile, these 3 are out here using a skill 2 or 3 every turn and doing stupidly good damage over an extended period of time. I mentioned before that Yisong is interesting in the sense that he has one very polarizing ID that can almost always outshine the rest of his. However, there's almost no other sinner that is as good of an example of this than Don Quixote. Sure, her 3-star ID lineup did recently get better with the addition of T-Corp Dawn, a pretty good Tremor ID that helps with that Archetype's mediocre clashing, and the addition of Time Moratorium, which destroys Sloth-weak enemies. However, sadly for her, Warp Dawn exists, and has existed since the launch of Limbus. As one of 2 IDs with a 5-coin skill, Warp Dawn works as a very strong nuker ID with Rip Space, and her skill 2, Leap, rolls well enough and inflicts Fragile. This is on the final coin, and ironically enough, Don Quixote's speed range isn't very high, so using it for the team on the whole isn't the most consistent thing, but if you get lucky, or use her yet-to-be-released Va Vigo that would definitely give her a lot of haste, then 20% more damage is just damn good no matter how you look at it. Her whole thing is just having really good damage, and therefore there's not much to say. She's a prime example of numbers and coins making a good ID. Her only actual downside is having some charge launch ID jank by requiring heads hit on her skill 1 to gain charge, which can be more frustrating than it would seem, but the rest of her kit is just much more solid than any other Dawn ID and most other IDs in general. And of course, speaking of W Corp IDs, W Corp Ryoshu. However, unlike Warp Dawn, Ryoshu recently got some actual competition this Walpurgisnacht in the form of Red Eye's Penitence Ryoshu. Now, I'll not be the first to admit that I may have slightly underrated Red Eye's Ryoshu on my updated tier list stream I did recently, but in my defense, I generally like to not overhype newer IDs since they are newer and I know less about them because of that. And also, I mean, those streams tend to get chaotic, so it's difficult to keep a singular train of thought, blah blah blah, excuses. The point is that Warp Ryoshu is not uncontested anymore. And while these 2 IDs are pretty similar, both being pretty straightforward charge IDs that gain a resource and then spend the resource, they do differ in some important ways. So allow me to do a quick comparison between these 2. First of all, Red Eye's Ryoshu is far tankier than Warp Ryoshu, and this applies to her kit as a whole rather than just base stats. Warp Ryoshu is a glass cannon through and through, with the exact opposite of Sustain, but we'll get to that in a second. In terms of skill 1s, this is a category where Red Eye's Ryoshu is just strictly better. Despite having 1 less coin, the clashing difference is staggering. Even when we account for the offense level difference between the 2, Warp Ryoshu clashes 6 lower than Red Eye's skill 1, and it's just one of the better skill 1s in the game overall, which is a big point in her favor, as I've discussed before with Ring Yi Sang. For skill 2s, while Red Eye's Ryoshu can roll a very nice and pretty consistent 22, it's hard to beat Warp Ryoshu in this aspect. A base roll of 17 is already ahead of the curve, but then it rolls up to a 23 with 15 plus charge count, inflicts 2 slash fragility at the start of the skill, so 20% more damage for the rest of it, and also deals even more extra damage if the target is on low enough HP, and that damage bonus applies to broken abnormality parts, leading to some crazy numbers on a skill 2 of all things. And then the skill 3s. Warp Ryoshu's DDEDR is a nuke that speaks for itself. It's incredibly potent and extremely accessible at that. Even if it can cost you some of your own HP, you can fire off one of the best nuke skills in the game on turn 3, which is valuable both for going fast and also for just being a good skill to clash with. Red Eye's Ryoshu, on the other hand, has 2 different skill 3s, Skullbuster and Serious Skullbuster. The first activates when you do not have 15 plus of both Red Eyes and Penitence, and the other activates if you do have that. Skullbuster is mostly just a pretty good skill 3, nothing too special, except for the fact that it rolls up to a 23 for free. But we're here for Serious Skullbuster, and though it does take a bit longer to build up to than DDEDR, it does a lot of damage on that last coin, as well as healing some SP and HP, just like the assumedly unserious Skullbuster variant. And topping it off with the only source of bind in her kits, applying 2 attack, power down, and 3 bind on the last coin too, in case you wanted some debuffs. Now, I'll wrap up my analysis in just a second here, but I need to talk about something. Butler Ryoshu released near the beginning of Season 4, based off of a certain enemy whose whole mechanic was called Binding Technique. In Butler Ryoshu's kit, there is a singular source of bind, and I mean that extremely literally. Instead, she's a Sank ID that's in denial, but okay, fine. Now she has the Red Eyes ID, alongside 2 egos, and we still don't have anything more for bind to synergize with? I mean, Red Eyes is the bind abnormality. Instead of unique charge, we couldn't have done unique bind or something? It's not a huge deal overall, it just would have been nice to have this ID be at the center of a new bind-focused team, but instead, what a fucking shame, we just got a really, really good ID. When scripting this video, I was hesitant to say whether Red Eye's Ryoshu is strictly stronger than Warp Ryoshu, but after looking at the passive and her whole kit again, I think it does push her over the edge. Making her deal more damage for just hitting the opponent, and a similar accelerated SP gain to Ring Yi Sang, there's honestly so many small damage modifiers, it's kinda hard to remember them all. If I had to summarize it nicely, Warp Ryoshu is the faster option of the two, with her stronger skill 2 and slightly easier access to her empowered skill 3, but Red Eye's Ryoshu wins out in consistency and in longer fights, bar none. All that said, I think that Red Eye's Ryoshu is probably our strongest Ryoshu ID overall now, and that's really weird to say considering just how prevalent Warp Ryoshu has been. And even though getting access to her isn't the easiest thing due to her being a Walpurgis Noct ID, it is nice that Warp Ryoshu is still an easily accessible and still very powerful ID to use. Ishmael's best overall ID, I would say, is Captain Ishmael. Simply put, assist attack is very good. And even if it does vary in value, it's always at least some extra damage and an extra ego resource. It's remarkably consistent considering the potential payoff, even without building a true resonance team, and if you do build a true resonance team around her, then the payoff is even better with the extra damage and power. Her offense level up buffs in the skill 2 means she's also just giving out a free clash power up often to 2 teammates, and her skill 3 isn't any slouch, especially if you can manage to have bleed on the enemy, which is actually possible in this day and age, believe it or not, and the SP heal is surprisingly more useful than you might think. Her numbers are admittedly not the greatest, when compared to other IDs we've seen at least. Especially no coin power conditional in that skill 2 certainly hurts a little bit, but it's already a very strong skill even without that, and remember, having pretty average numbers isn't a bad thing. Her sanity system, however, is maybe the biggest downside to running her. Since whereas most IDs only lose sanity when higher or equal level allies are killed, Captain Ishmael is greedy and gets pissy if she's not given enough of the glory, meaning you need to feed kills to her, otherwise she will begin to roll lower than you'd like. Of course, this isn't really a problem in focused encounters and single enemy fights, but it is worth being wary of if you're a Mirror Dungeon gamer, since she's not the best ID to blindly run into that. Perhaps the most noteworthy thing about Ishmael in this video is that even though her highs aren't the highest, she has an incredibly consistent roster of IDs. All of her 3 stars are more than viable in their own right. Reindeer has an excellent skill 1 and skill 3, Liu Ishmael has incredibly solid numbers, especially if you get off that skill 3 coin power buff, Mulder Ishmael is a cornerstone of syncing with that passive and skill 3 of hers, and even the new Zwei Ishmael seems like she has her place on Tremor teams and is generally useful with tankiness and more than good enough numbers and damage. She's probably the only Sinner in the game where you absolutely cannot go wrong with any of her 3 stars, and I find that very impressive and definitely worth noting, even if Captain Ishmael does stand maybe a little bit above the rest. On the other hand, Faust is more similar to Ryoshu's situation in the sense that her strongest ID would be relatively uncontested until a couple months ago. Regret Faust has been the predominant Faust ID since the first Walpurgis Noct, and though Faust still has her places in the game where her particularly unique SP heal mechanic is useful, it hasn't been until Multicrack Faust that Regret has truly been overthrown. Though, before I talk about Multicrack, I do want to say that Regret Faust is still a very good ID, and her value has only increased as the game has gone on. Since Tremor went from non-existent to actually good, and prominent fights with multiple targets went from about 50-50 to very relevant for specifically Railway 4, and surely Railway content will become permanent eventually, so that I can solidly say that XID is good for Y Railway, not cringe thinking about how they will eventually all fade away in time, like all things do. Except prosthetics, so Multicrack Faust. She falls into the niche of charge potency IDs, consisting of only 3 members at the time of making this video, and no, Red Eye's Ryoshu doesn't count, I don't care what it says on the label. This subset of IDs are centered around spending charge count to convert into charge potency. In Multicrack Faust's case, you require 10 charge count to get 1 charge potency, as well as 3 envy for the passive to be active. I always found it strange that these charge potency IDs don't have this as an always active clause in their passives, but regardless, her skills roll completely bog standard without her conditionals, and roll very well with them. Her skill 1 and skill 2 work off of charge count for their coin power, and her skill 3 continuously ramps up based on accumulated charge potency, up to a max roll of 32 at 4 charge potency, which does take a while to get to since her charge count gain is actually quite slow outside of this skill 3. It is worth mentioning that if you just use a skill 1 into a skill 3, you immediately get one of these coin power bonuses, since any amount of charge count also gives you 1 charge potency. Your skill 2 is the main method of converting charge count into potency, since, like Warp Ryoshu, you can sacrifice that worthless HP and turn it into charge count to make up for the difference to spend for coin power and damage via this weird conditional that requires 3+ resonance, including this skill, to activate in order to do extra damage based on spent charge count. This is a lot of extra damage if you have the charge count to spare, especially on a skill that's already rolling a 22. So even though the conditional doesn't really make much sense, be sure to try and fulfill it to get the most out of her. Though I mentioned her charge count gain isn't very good outside the skill 3, killing an enemy will net her and 2 allies more charge count, and there's a certain other multi-crack ID that synergizes beautifully with her, as well as sources of charge barrier, but none of these conditions need to be met for her to be strong. Since even if you have to use her underwhelming charge count gain via the skill 1, it doesn't feel all too bad considering the payoff is using the skill 3 that inflicts Envy Fragility into an empowered Envy skill 2, dealing a ton of extra damage from multiple sources. So, although Multicrack Faust at first comes across as an ID that isn't very good for shorter fights due to getting so much from ramping up, I would argue she's just damn solid wherever you put her, and just especially good for those longer chain battles and general fights. Second to last to talk about, we have Meursault, who is very interesting. While yes, ego synergy can have a big impact on an ID's viability, you may have noticed I tend to not talk about them very much. The only one I've directly mentioned as being particularly great so far is Rhymeshank, and that's because it is so strongly associated with the Echirodian in my mind, it could be interpreted as romantic. But I have to address the straight-jacketed Frenchman in the room. Regret Meursault, or as the French would call it, Meursault de regret, is a statistical anomaly that really changes how one views Meursault. If we don't account for its -1 to base power and +2 coin power, Meursault has one of the worst ID lineups in the game. If we do account for it, all of a sudden, it's much better. You can come to your own conclusion if you want to consider regret when thinking about Meursault IDs, but accounting for it or not, his best ID is absolutely Blade Lineage Mentor Meursault. Now, yes, he does have very good skills, and using regret with him means you're rolling very high and have easier access to claiming bones, and I will get to that, but I think one of his biggest draws as an ID is how he makes the Blade Lineage team come together to form a pretty solid lineup. Now, I won't pretend like this is easy to do. Sure, the Season 3 event IDs will be available soon, but you gotta shard BL Dawn, BL Faust, and BL Meursault, and you do want to have Blade Lineage Sang if you don't have him already. However, if you do have the ability to make a Pride Resonance team to make his passive pop off, then it'll do very well. Back to Meursault himself. It's worth talking about just how good his numbers and damage are when you use Regret on him, and give him maybe a bit of support via Blade Lineage Sang or Butler Ryoshu's support passive to help supplement his potentially slightly lacking poise count. Clashing at a 16, 26, and 9 in the proper context is kinda crazy. And it's not like feeling regret should take longer than 2-ish turns. And that's definitely an ego that seems like it will only get more value in the future with longer chain battles to take advantage of it earlier. The 9 clash on the skill 3 in particular is perfect for losing, and then proceeding to do the funny, if by funny you mean vehicular manslaughter via sword. To claim their bones, while certainly not a traditional skill 3 nuke, is still very powerful. And getting it to activate only gets easier as enemy numbers should get higher. It's hard to say just how much damage this skill does, or can do, considering the sheer amount of extra damage conditionals, but let's just say that he does a lot of damage, and move on from it. His skill 1 is pretty standard, but rolls well and supplements the Blade Lineage team with poise, and his skill 2's extra damage conditional on crit is both very satisfying and very potent. And while I would like to talk more about the Blade Lineage team and how he boosts them to viability, I did make a video on it, and I'd hate to just repeat myself, so you can either watch that, or read all of his text in depth and come to your own conclusions, but you're on an ESCU video for God's sake. I know you're probably incapable of doing that, and that's okay, it's good for me. The long and the short of it is that Meursault does something that no other ID gets close to, and that's putting an entire team, quite literally, on his back, and doing a really good job at it. More importantly, even outside of the context of a Blade lineage team, he can be used to great effect, made even better with a poise count support passive, and even better if you use Regret. It's hard to imagine he'll ever be replaced in a Pride Resonance, or especially a Blade lineage team, so if you want to spam Resonance and see stupidly high clashing numbers and plan to stick to one of those teams, Blade lineage Meursault is absolutely the right choice, and now I just have to hope that Sync Meursault doesn't come out and blow Blade lineage Meursault out of the water, but I have my doubts about that happening. Naturally, saving the best for last, the final sinner to talk about is Heathcliff, where I will finally be updating my thoughts on the strongest Heathcliff ID, Sunshower Heathcliff, who I last made a video on over a year ago, which is crazy considering just how prominent he is in the game. And yeah, I know, that might be a bit controversial, though, never mind. Yeah, I forgot. We're actually going to be talking about Rabbit Heathcliff and his funny quick suppression. Sure. Yeah, you know what? The Harpooner Heathcliff also fits, with his insane potential to deal so much extra damage based on low HP. Okay, fine. It's not that simple. While I will obviously be shining a particular spotlight on Wild Hunt Heathcliff, since he is the most complicated of these four— Wait, why are you still— Get out of here. Come on. No one wants to hear. Anyways, he's the most complicated of these three, the best for clickbait, and while I also do think he is the strongest, it does vary a lot. Rabbit Heathcliff does still have quick suppression, and his other skills are good, even if they do rightfully get overshadowed. And while I understand thinking he's still the best Heathcliff ID, I think his lack of consistency without body sack on his skill 2 especially kind of drags him down. It's all well and good to use body sack before firing off a skill 3, but there's just no guaranteeing that 16 roll in the skill 2 unless we actually commit to using body sack every turn, and ammo is finally starting to become a problem, and it likely only gets worse as chain battles hopefully become actually difficult in regular content. This isn't to say he's fallen off, in fact it's very impressive that he's still so relevant despite all the changes Limbus has gone through. On the other hand, Harpooner Heathcliff I find is heavily favored by recent trends. His passive is simply insane, and while no, it is not realistic to maintain 1% HP at all times for 99% more damage, even being at half health means everything you do is dealing 50% more damage, not to mention the potential to gain offense level up if you just tank some one-sided attacks. It's important to mention that this damage boost applies to anything he does. Fire off an AEDD, that's 1.5 times damage. Fire off binds at 20% HP? Yeah, that's kinda crazy. And I know I mentioned not mentioning ego, but you can do this with any of his ego, not just one in particular. He's also a fantastic potential member to add on to modern bleed teams, since he can finally gain poise potency from his skill 2 to crit for the potential 10 bleed count. But getting those out of the way, what does Wild Hunt Heathcliff bring to the table? Well, the short answer is a lot, but I know that's not nearly good enough for an ID like this, so from the top, Wild Hunt Heathcliff without conditionals has pretty mediocre numbers for 3-star. 11, 14, and 18 is actually more in the realm of 2-star IDs, but unlike those 2 stars, he has sinking conditionals that fix those numbers right up, maxing out at 16, 20, and 26, not accounting for any additional clash power-up outside of the skills themselves. These skills aren't particularly special when you start off a fight, besides his skill 2 inflicting a debuff that makes Abnos roll heads 10% less, which is very nice if you find yourself getting screwed over by RNG, but the more important skill to talk about isn't any of his regular attack skills, it's his defensive skill, O Dullahan. This is the first counter in Limbus that works like how counters used to function in Library of Ruina, which is to say this works as a regular clashing skill, and it rolls a 13 by default, and with sinking conditionals fulfilled, you can have a 17 clashing skill basically anytime you wish, and it's this counter that allows us to gain the horse. Dullahan is a very unique status effect that gives you a few buffs, specifically +3 offense level, +1 min and max speed, so essentially 1 haste, at the cost of 3 defense level and losing a varying amount of SP on turn end for as long as you have Dullahan. Maneuvering on and off of Dullahan is pretty much the name of the game for Wild Hunt Heathcliff, since it allows him to spam his alternative skill 3, Lament, Mourn, Despair, by using his counter. But in exchange for doing that, you lose access to the horse the next turn. Really quick, this skill is a good example of the last factor that can indicate an ID is really good, and we've seen it before, but here especially, extra damage conditionals. Lament, Mourn, and Despair has a fuck ton of these, and for that reason, it deals a fuck ton of damage. But the reason why spamming this skill is so good, outside of that obvious good damage, is that it's his best way to gain Coffin, which is a status that has a max value of 10 and gives different and more buffs at various thresholds. For every 3 Coffin, he gains 2 damage up buffs to a max of 6 damage up at just 9 Coffin. For every 4 Coffin, his minimum speed is raised by 1 to a max of 2 more minimum speed raised, meaning his speed range at 8 Coffin while on Dullahan is a ridiculously consistent 6 to 9. And lastly, he gains a Clash power-up for every 5 Coffin to a max of 2 Clash power-up at 10 Coffin. Combining all these buffs together, needless to say, Wild Hunt Heathcliff at 10 Coffin is pretty much the best ID in the game. And since that's the case, we want to get to 10 Coffin as soon as possible, and therefore we want to keep using Lament, Mourn, and Despair due to it giving us 2 Coffin on use. Obviously, we also want to kill enemies in order to activate this effect here, as well as his passive, since both of those give us even more Coffin, and this is Wild Hunt Heathcliff's biggest downside, quote-unquote. He needs things to kill. In fights where bodies are available, he's a monster. But outside of Railway 4, those fights are generally pretty easy. But if you find yourself struggling with any of them, Wild Hunt Heathcliff, especially with 2 skill slots, will eat them alive. However, there's a lot more to say about this kit, like maximizing damage on Lament, Mourn, and Despair. Since this is a negative coin skill, we want to be on as low of SP as possible when using it. Let's assume we are starting at around 45 SP when we use our counter to get Dullahan. We luckily already lose 5 SP just for mounting Dullahan to begin with. If we then proceed to not clash and use a skill 2, we lose 10 more SP after the attack and 15 more on turn end, assuming we have no Coffin, which very conveniently leaves us at 15 SP, which is the minimum amount needed to fire off Lament, Mourn, and Despair as a counter. If you have a regular skill 3 lined up, that will also turn into Lament, Mourn, and Despair, and you can use that on even lower SP if you want. Waiting longer to use LMD does mean more damage, since it scales with how long you've had Dullahan, up to 3 turns, though do be careful going too far into the negatives with Dullahan, since you will lose your horse if you can't maintain enough mental stability to hold the reins, just like in real life. Probably, I don't know, I've never been on a horse. And don't worry about how low your Sandy has ended up getting, since Lament, Mourn, and Despair has a Sandy back policy if you're in the negatives, which isn't quite possible when using the counter version, but if you kill an enemy with it, you'll shoot back up a ton via Wild Hunt's innate Sandy gain on killing any enemy regardless of level, and the 15 SP from LMD's on-kill effect. Once you've ramped up your Coffin to around the 4 to 6 range, Wild Hunt Heathcliff is already basically unstoppable, which means you will need to cycle spamming counters for 4 to 6 turns, which isn't necessarily bad, but do bear in mind you need to have enough SP to keep using LMD as a counter. But enough about that one skill, since his other skills are also really damn good once you're fully ramped. As I talk about the rest of his kit, I would like for you to bear in mind that you're dealing up to 60% more damage during all of this. His skill 1 and skill 2 can now clash at an 18 and 22 respectively with the additional 2 clash power, and his skill 2 is just a crazy AoE skill that makes ramping up bodies even easier once you start gaining enough Coffin to give it attack weight. His regular skill 3, Requiem, is definitely a good skill, but you should basically never use it unless it's turn 1 of a fight, since LMD is better in every conceivable way except for clashing, since it is negative and that can be a bit consistent, but the clash win for 10 more SP is good to start off a fight with, but that's about it. So where does all this leave us? Well, Wild Hunt Heathcliff is really, really strong and ramped up, but can take a while to get there, and suffers quite a bit when he doesn't have cadavers to consume. But he's still a stupidly good ID that can be used in any fight if you're willing to do the work of placing a defensive skill more than once in a battle, which I can't even think of any other IDs that do that, so that's really hard. The fact I completely skipped over his revival mechanic should speak volumes about the sheer amount of stuff Wild Hunt Heathcliff has, and even if you don't agree that he's as strong as I say, at least he's undeniably top tier in terms of IDs who are having a good time while fighting. And that's all the strongest IDs I wanted to cover in this video. At least one for each sinner, and I didn't miss a single one of them on purpose anyway. Nope. That's all. Okay. Look, if it'll make you feel better, I do think that Edgar Family Air Gregor is a very good ID now. But it's specifically because of Solemn Lament, and it's not in the same way as Regret with Meursault. But it is worth mentioning that he has excellent synergy with this fantastic ego due to him being sinking and having plus coin boost plus damage up on his skill 3 to increase the damage of this monster of a nuke. But looking at Edgar Gregor as an ID compared to the other IDs I've discussed, I mean, there's just no way he's of the same caliber as them, and the other Gregor IDs fall even further behind. Hopefully Season 5 is the time I can finally say Gregor has an ID that is truly the strongest in some capacity, but I cannot do that as of right now. I know some of you watching this video may have gotten to this point and are now sadly kicking dirt and muttering to yourself, "Aw man, I don't have any of these strongest IDs, life is unfair." First of all, yeah, I know, things haven't been the same since your dad left, and secondly, lucky for you, Limbus is not a hard game. You can get by with basically anything, and I don't want this video to push any kind of narrative that you need to conform to these most meta of meta IDs. I do think it's important to be able to tell what IDs are good or not for your own enjoyment, since investing into an ID you think is good and want to use them because they are good, and then later finding out that they most definitely aren't, I don't think would be very fun. And at the end of the day, Limbus Company is a game. And since it is a game that allows us to use whatever IDs you want to clear content, you should use what's fun, whether that be the top tier IDs, or just the ones you find particularly neat. But that's all from me for now. And I know this video isn't as grand a finale for Season 4 as what I did with Season 3, but I hope you enjoyed it regardless, and learned something or were just entertained. This video ends now.